Hello, audience. My name is Dalton Mortimer, and I am the authenticator. And sometimes in life, when you really need to get shit done, and you really need to get shit out there, you don't have time to make it structured, polished, and pretty. Sometimes you put the rage before the reason, and sometimes you put the storm before the calm, however counterproductively. So welcome, dear audience, to the very first video on this channel, and the very first in a series I like to call The Storm Before the Calm, Rants. For anyone that knows me or is familiar with my work, or appearances on other channels, you know I downright hate postmodernism. And for those of you that further know me, probably remember that initially this video was meant to be something of a reply to the work of Dr. Jordan Peterson, probably the most famous current intellectual who is presenting himself in opposition to postmodernism. But my reasons are somewhat different than Dr. Peterson's because I come to it from a philosophical perspective rather than a socio-political perspective. I'm not a consequentialist, I'm a rationalist. And so many people get so caught up in all the things that postmodernism does do wrong, and it does, make no mistake about it, that no one has ever stopped to ask, is it even worth salvaging from its base premises, from the beginning, from its most fundamental aspects? Answer? No. And when you look at its most fundamental aspects in conjunction with the rest of it, the pieces that Dr. Peterson happens to be missing in this case, it's even worse overall. Which isn't to say that I blame Dr. Peterson. I mean, he's a busy guy, and when the consequences of a thing are this dire, no one could be blamed for forgetting that it has a thing unto itself that is also in drastic need of a philosophical overhaul and dissection. He doesn't have the time, nor the resources, nor even probably the care to look at it from the frankly myopic and a little bit hypersensitive perspective. However, I'm just a smuck ranting on YouTube, so I do, hence the rant. Hopefully, we can glean some sort of Socratic or perhaps even Sherlock Holmesian example of where little things can go wrong and lead to drastically different conclusions, where the math goes wrong at the beginning, and that's why so many people go so wrong by the end. But before we can check for mistakes in our mental philosophical math, as it were, it probably would be better to set up the equation that we're actually trying to solve here. In the immortal words of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, if you want to know the answer and how it pertains to any fucking thing, it's probably better to understand what the actual question is. And thereby we lead rather nicely into a few things. 1, why I call myself the authenticator. 2, what the hell even is postmodernism. And 3, what is the history of it? Hint, it's not quite as simple as Marxism, despite what Dr. Peterson would have you believe. Which isn't to say that I necessarily disagree with it, mind you, just that I don't think it goes back quite far enough. This has been a long-standing problem, caused by several seemingly minor at the time, but often long-standing issues that have now coalesced and conglomerated into a right clusterfuck of a problem. A right clusterfuck of a problem which, if left unchecked, will lead to all kinds of other issues and entangle itself within the tentacles of the most simplistic and toxic ideologies it can get a hold of, because it has no reason to do anything else. But I'm digressing again. Where did we leave off? Oh yes, at the very beginning. Sorry about that. Specifically, the very beginning of philosophical thought itself. And more specifically, the difference between rationalism and empiricism. Rationalism being the apprehension that the largest obstacle to us knowing and understanding the world and ourselves is the categorization of information and essentially self-knowledge and self-understanding. It is the rationalist school, for example, that led to phrases like, the unexamined life is not worth living, know thyself, and all that I know is that I know nothing. This school is not particularly concerned with our instrumentation for measuring the world. It is instead concerned with what we do with that information once we have it and what it actually says about anything. More or less, it is preoccupied with the notion that external reality and external means of obtaining knowledge and truth are fixed and impermeable. Thereby, the only real questions one need ask are the ones about what happens to that information because of any given perspective on it, and thus focuses primarily on more abstract reasoning variables and concrete logic as opposed to external, impermanent, and incidental factors. Empiricism, on the other hand, is, well, pretty much everything else. Empiricism is very preoccupied with how we gain knowledge, because in empiricism's view, unlike rationalism, all data is not necessarily equal, therefore some of the data can be discarded. The problem that this creates, however, is when it comes time to evaluate the data. Naturally, in any given system, there's room for both of these. You have to have a gathering instrument and an evaluative instrument. And for most of the early days of philosophy, both systems were preoccupied with both the concept of truth and the concept of value, phrasing these usually in the form of various questions, which could be just about anything, but I have termed rather broadly in this circumstance as the truth question and the value question. Shortly thereafter, though, things got messy, because truth needed the focus because we didn't understand much about the world at the time. And value was always seemingly up in the air. And so, the value question was slowly over the centuries shelved. Aristotle and Socrates may have argued over the good, but by the Enlightenment, science had made significant leaps, and thus we didn't really need to address the value question just yet, because we were finally getting what appeared to be an accurate version of the world, and fine-tuning said accuracy rather nicely. The problem is that to function efficiently, empiricism has to disregard certain variables in favor of others, create a worthiness hierarchy or a truthfulness hierarchy, and thus some of the data gets either shunted back to the recycling drive of the subconscious in the form of things like religion and authority, or shorthanded out of existence by those very same things for the time being. And for a time this worked out quite well, because it seemed like science had all the pragmatic answers and a significant degree of the technical and truthful ones. The problem is that sometimes the pre-established placeholders, like authority and religion, often get ousted. Frequently, in fact. And this creates something of a vacuum. I.e., if you can't trust your leaders, or those you hold in authority, and you can't trust your religion or your philosophy, then what do you do, and what does it all mean? And if it doesn't mean anything, then what good is this truth you've discovered? Because a meaningless truth is by definition just that, meaningless. And some people still clung to the rationalist school and attempted to provide substantive answers. Each of them, though, using a similar method of Occam's razor as the empiricist would often disregard variables in favor of others, thereby creating somewhat limited meta-narratives. And in such a case, there will eventually rise systems that are so overly simplified that it misses out on several key variables. And if you can be convinced that certain variables are less valuable than others, then could you potentially be convinced that none of the variables was ever important, and that it was all a persistent and stubborn illusion created by human needs, wants, desires, and potentially the senses. And there, ladies and gentlemen, is where we have the problem. A long-standing but frequently ignored question can often seem arbitrary and unimportant. And sometimes if you leave a question mark open enough, it will start to look like a zero. Hence, the fact that there was no answer, or concrete answer at least, to the question of value meant that there was no value, or potentially there was no value. And doubly hence, all value must therefore be an illusion. And then enter Hegel. See, Hegel was a guy who had a theory about history, who wanted to treat history like a story. And in all stories, in all narratives, you need something to drive it. And what Hegel chose was the most easy and approachable cause that he could think of, which was conflict. All history, he thought, was a twist and turn between the binaries of one force conflicting with another force, be that force an idea, an empire, a ideological war, etc., etc. Now, anyone who's even studied history for more than 5 seconds could tell you that some of the greatest things that ever happened in history were actually having nothing to do or were minimally impacted by such large-scale collateral fights. But this was good enough for Hegel. And the part where we come in is the part where he thought he was, and the part that he thought came after it. Because Hegel also had a theory that history was successfully getting better all the time. Because remember, he saw the whole thing like a story. And a good story, of course, results in the villain losing and the hero winning. Only he didn't think the hero was already there, he thought the hero was yet to be made. And so he imagined history getting constantly better. And for those of my viewers that might be more politically astute, yes, if this is sounding familiar to the same sort of mental hang-ups that progressives in the modern era have, yeah, you're right, that's where this comes from. And also from it comes the terminology he used. He referred to his era and the surrounding eras as the pre-modern era. He then acknowledged the future that he could potentially foresee as the modern era, where he thought that because only those things that could definitely be verified could withstand multiple clashes in his historical dialectic, things would become exceedingly minimalized and efficient. Hence why modern art looks like minimalistic dog shit and or something sterile from a hospital or a sci-fi movie. And why modern architecture, in contrast to the Gothic architecture and the Art Deco architecture that came before it, became very, very streamlined, very, very stripped down, and very, very monotoned. Because yes, while he considered it a model for history, he applied it mostly to things that people thought had value. Things like art, things like culture, etc., etc. Because again, his main focus was trying to figure out how the illusion of value came about if it was so abstract and indecipherable. Now, granted, if you're like me, you're screaming at the screen right now, well, maybe it's not an illusion, maybe you broke the premise when you started. But this apparently didn't occur to him. It was a blind spot, and it's a blind spot that we've been paying for just about ever since. Because while it started in art and culture, it didn't end there, as we just saw with the progressive example. And so too did not end there what he thought came after the modern era. He thought that eventually, given enough precision and enough thought, even the most concrete of objects, even the most concrete of ideas and concepts, would become increasingly scrutinized and thereby increasingly degraded. And essentially, he thought that it was humans' destiny to be free from all conception of meaning by destroying everything that he thought possessed the illusion of meaning, and thus humankind would be living free of any illusions in a perfect world, because, as we've established, history is getting better. Lols. And the story ends with one great big, happy, postmodern, apparently meaningless, but okay because we're all pleased and pleasurable utopia. If this is sounding familiar to you, all you need to do is switch out all conflict for class conflict, and you have the beginnings of one of Hegel's successors, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, who developed, say it with me now, Marxism, where instead of a postmodernist utopia, you ultimately had a communist one, because Marx corrected Hegel by saying the only thing that matters is people, and by extension, the worker. And this is where the two form an unholy alliance, and why I cannot imagine why a self-respecting Marxist, as if there would be such a thing, would allow for postmodernism, because eventually even the Marxist meta-narrative would fall victim to Hegel's dialectic. But hey, thought Marx, Hegel had some good ideas, maybe I can fix it. But he didn't stop to think that postmodernism itself was just a stepping stone to overall nihilism. Because once you've convinced yourself that everything is a social construct, vis-a-vis Rousseau, who had already come and gone and planted that idea in people's heads, then you can change society into whatever you want, and because humans are social animals and socially constructed identities themselves, a la Foucault, meaning is itself rendered an illusion, and that illusion, ironically, is considered an obstacle to freedom that must, and indeed should, be destroyed. And the greatest irony? All that effort everyone put into answering the truth question, it's not going to go to any work anyway, because once you can be persuaded that any objective truth is the result of a social construct, then the objective truth itself comes into question. And after all, what good is a meaningless truth? If it has no meaning anyway, why not just ignore it in favor of something else? But we need the filters in place to do that, and so they put the filters there, and hence authoritarianism is the only result. And as for David Hume and his theory of the pleasures and the pain, well, you've just rendered all pleasure meaningless because it's just a sensory apparatus, but pain is instinctual. Pain hurts no matter how much you want it not to. So you've essentially created a system where pain exists and pleasure is an illusion. Well fucking done. And from this pain and pleasure dynamic that is now lopsided to all hell, you essentially get the only thing that truly mattering in this world is power. And power is to be defined by whoever has it in relation to whoever doesn't, and oppressor and oppressed, so on and so on. But I've muddied the waters enough. I wanted this to be focused mostly on specific things, and instead I talked the majority of it in terms of generalities. I wanted to go into the generalities at the beginning, but the beginning slowly became the whole video. So I think I'm just going to make this part 1 and bid you all adieu. So join me next time, hopefully, where my audio quality will be a little bit better. I'll be a little bit better at speaking, God willing, and we'll actually get down to looking at this as though it's a mathematical equation. We've set up the equation, we've set up the history of it, And now, all that's left for me to say is, cheers, lads. Cheers, everyone. And I'll see you all next time.